Okay, we are going to start the second part of Lecture 3. And as I said, we were looking at the data I collected from you guys to give you just a very, very brief feeling for how this network analysis is done. I did this all by hand. Of course, I didn't use any software, and so I did a very simple analysis. But as you know, I just collected one piece of information from you. Who says what to whom? So I asked you, who do you communicate with? How much do you communicate with each person? And I specified all kinds of communication. If we had a little more time and I had the software, I could have asked you, how much do you communicate in person, via text, online, right? All sorts of different ways of measuring. And I could have asked you what you communicate about. But all we wanted to know was, who do you communicate with? And, how much? A little, average, or a lot, 1, 2, or 3. And then I also asked you who communicates with you and how much, a little, average, and a lot. So what I am trying to get from that is the relational perspective, right? Not just who you communicate with, but who communicates with you. And then you'll see in just a minute, I can also see from your perspective who you communicate with, but then from everybody else's perspective, how many of them think they communicate with you. So there's kind of a back and forth in here that creates that richness of that link. This was very limited. It's anonymous. I gave you guys letters. This is not in alphabetical order. And we just, as I said, use this one data point. Okay, so here in this class analysis, right, how much do you communicate with each person? And if you take a look on the left-hand side from person A to person H, their responses are going horizontally across the page here, right? How much do you communicate with each person? So person A, right, is telling us on a scale of 1 to 3 how much they communicate with each person. And then at the far right, you will see each person gets a total score, right, on how much they communicate with other people. So person A got a total score of 12. So this is based on person A's self-report, right? Then if you come back and you go down the first column that says person A, you are seeing how everybody else said they communicate with person A, how much they communicate with person A, a little, average, or a lot. So you go down to the bottom and you can see a score for person A of 13 based on what we call the other report. So the far right-hand side is the self-report and the bottom row is what I call the other report. What we can do then with this is see some interesting dynamics that happen between self-report and other report. This is especially true for persons E, F, G, and H. I'll talk about the others in a minute, but what I want you to notice is the highest self-report comes from person E at 16, right? And the lowest self-report comes from person H at 8. And H is underneath the yellow block, right? And I did this so you could kind of see it a little faster. So G and H both had they had their lowest self-report of 9 and 8 as a total. And the other report, if you go down to the last row, you will see that the way others reported, right, how much they communicate with persons G and H, a little bit higher at 13 and 11. What you see here is this identification by yourself, by person G and H as isolates, right? They're saying, I don't talk much to other people. And yet, other people's perceptions, right, of how much they communicate with persons G and H is higher. So it's kind of a self-identified isolate, if you want. We will talk about person E and F as having the most communication. And you remember, the most communication is always a sign that you have a bridge or a liaison. And with this particular question, what you have are persons E and F who communicate out to others. So they're going outward to others, right? And their perception of how much they communicate outward to others is the highest. So that's a good kind of insight that they are going to be a bridge or a liaison, right? Then the other thing you'll see in person E, right, you'll see person E saying, oh, I highlighted person E. I'm sorry, I did that a little confusing. This was hard. No, I'm sorry, person D, excuse me, person D, who says, whose average was 13 of how much they communicate with other people, right? And then if you go down the column of person D to the bottom row, you'll see other people in measuring how much they communicate with person D say 10. So that discrepancy, even though it's not a huge amount, but that discrepancy oftentimes is also kind of a clue that you may have one of these cosmopolites, one of these butterflies that reaches out to people, right? And their perceptions of reaching out to people. And remember, also being a community builder. Okay, the second question was, how much does each person communicate with you, right? So how much do they come to you? Again, helping us identify whether they're a bridge or a liaison. And again, you will see the far right column, right? You see the same people, persons E and F, showing up as the one that self-identify that people come and talk to them a lot, right? And persons G and F are identifying as the people that have the least amount of contact that people communicate with them. Their perception of how much people communicate with them is lower. And then again, we have this same irony on the bottom row, that while persons G and H self-identify as the lowest, right, they're not necessarily ranked the lowest by other people as the people, right, that people communicate with. So again, you have this interesting back and forth. The final thing you notice, going back to person D is a little less on this one. How much does each person communicate with you, right? And person D was at a 12, and then in the self-report and in the other report at 11. That's another clue that person D might be a social butterfly or a cosmopolite or a community builder, because it's all about the information going out as opposed to coming in. Again, I know this is kind of hard to absorb. I'll bring these to class and we can talk a little more about them. But I want to again remind you, it's the relational back and forth of self-perception and others' perception of where the flow of the communication is. Okay, so then what we do is we go back and we look at, just let me show you here for just a second. We look at, let me see if I can go back one. Here we go. We go back and we look at the reciprocal connections. So you'll see that person A said that they communicate with person E, right, a lot. And then if you go down to person E, right, person E will say they communicate with person A a lot. That's considered a reciprocal connection, right, because they're agreeing with each other. As opposed to, for example, if you look at person C, who says person B, they say, I communicate on average with person C, but person C is saying, I only communicate a little with person B. So this is not necessarily reciprocal in the perception, again, the perception of the amount of communication. So what we do is we build this map, right, that shows the reciprocal communications that exist. Now, I took everybody who had 3 and 3s or 3 and 2 and 2s, right, for reciprocal communication, just because average and a lot. If I just took the allots, I don't get enough detail. And what you can see here is a couple of things. You can see, remember we thought that G and H were our isolates, if you recall, right? But actually what you see is C and H being more of the isolates because they only have one reciprocal relationship, right? They may have more total relationship and communications with people, but in terms of reciprocal back and forth, C and H are much more of the isolates here. And you'll see that E and F, right, who we thought E and F were our bridges or our liaisons, and you can see that E, in a sense, is more of a liaison because E sits between C and H and the others. So information flows through E, right, from C and H to the others. And F is more of a bridge in the sense that F is bridging, right, what's going on. So it's not real clear with this kind of limited analysis if they're a bridge or a liaison, but you see that these are what we call our strong relational roles. You also see down here that D and G, right, that, I have this all in a square, that A, D, G, and F are really a group, right? There's a lot of reciprocal communication going on, except between D and G. So there's a flow of communication here. And then B plays a very interesting role. You could call B an dyad because they have reciprocal relationships with two people. But I said that wrong. G and D would be dyads because they have reciprocal relationships with other people, but not necessarily with each other. But B is either an isolate that E and F are reaching out to, right? Or B is sort of playing a role of almost like a bridge through B and F between these two groups. So you can see some interesting roles. You can kind of think about what the roles might be. If you had a little more data and you were actually running through a network analysis program, you would be more confident about them. But it's definitely clear from the amount of communication and then the reciprocal links, right, that people are emerging in different roles, right, in this network, in our little network here. So what do we know from our class example? G and H are self-isolates but not recognized as such by others. That's kind of this interesting thing in their self-report. And in fact, as we saw, it's actually H and C that appear in terms of relationships, reciprocal communication, to be a little more of the isolates than G. E is perhaps a liaison, as I mentioned. F is the bridge. And then we think that D and A may be the community builders, the cosmopolites, because they seem to go in and out a lot. So this is just an example, right, of how you can identify these roles. And it's not necessarily the people you might assume have those roles. And especially in an organization where the formal roles and the formal communication are so prescribed, this informal networking analysis can reveal a lot of interesting information. So I want to kind of tie up my 3 lectures by talking about organizational communication and where we are today in COVID with all the virtual communication going on and how things are moving and changing in terms of the organizational communication patterns I've been talking about. So there's a couple things I think we need to be aware of. Obviously, we did not make this transition to having virtual workplaces deliberately or thoughtfully necessarily. Some organizations were already having some virtual meetings, but the idea of working from home and having virtual meetings versus being either in your office or in a conference room where everybody's together, right, is very different. So this huge transition that working from home completely virtually, right, was spontaneous and definitely chaotic. Those first couple of months, if you see this in the public education system clearly, but trying to get everybody up and running in this and in the classes. We also know it will settle down. It's already settled down a lot. You're seeing new improvements in the software that's coming out. Microsoft quickly jumped on board to try and improve what it had because it felt like it needed to compete with Zoom, right? And so we will see this begin to settle down. And I think it raises an interesting question about the virtual versus the non-virtual work worlds. Because, of course, we have non-virtual work worlds, right? Production lines, grocery stores. We have a lot of face-to-face work worlds still, and especially in public and community services in terms of person-to-person services. But I think we're going to see more and more virtual work worlds and then non-virtual work worlds. How many work worlds will return, right, to non-virtual or stay completely virtual? And I wonder what that's going to do. Is there going to be some kind of a status distinction that one's better than the other? Is there going to be some kind of distinction in terms of how we value those services? I think about doctor's offices, and I think doctor's offices are loving these virtual doctor appointments, but I don't think we as patients feel we get the same kind of care. So I think we're going to see that it's going to be a challenge as this continues. And it certainly is going to be a challenge with the communication patterns. So we know we have changing channels of communication, right? And those changing channels have increased the amount of communication that goes on, although it's virtually with Zooms, right? And I think it's increased the amount of data, information. And what that means is, remember, it means it creates uncertainty and ambiguity, right? So we understand that the changing channels of communication challenge us to make those channels as rich as possible given the limitations of those channels. We also know that formal communication patterns are changing, and I think we're going to see more and more research on this. I suspect we're going to find that there is more upward flow of communication because the way Zoom meetings are set up, it's harder to control them in the same way as a face-to-face meeting. But we're also going to see perhaps, right, a little more sense of equality among people in a meeting because you don't have a hierarchical rank of who's at the top of the table and who's at the far end of the table. I don't know that, but I'm just speculating on that. But we want to be aware that those formal communication patterns, right, and looking at them to see how they might be changing. And then finally, I think the informal roles will be changing. I don't think we have the same informal communication opportunities, and if we do have them, right, we may be having them through different channels. So any kind of informal analysis is probably going to need to take into consideration the various channels people are using to interact with each other informally. We also don't necessarily have as many nonverbal cues in this virtual world that we're facing. And that's another thing that we're going to have to decide how valuable that is and important it is. So, I thought it might be interesting to think about how our three organizational patterns might view these changes. And I came up with a couple of things. I was thinking about the classical pattern, right, who would see this technology as tools for efficiency and production, right, productivity. I think the concerns are how do we control that worker, right, in a virtual world to make sure they're being efficient and productive. I'm sure in a very classical organization, people working from home is causing great angst in either human resources department or in the upper administration because it's a sense of are we controlling our worker in that world, right? We know that they're saving money in certain regards because there's less brick and mortar costs, right? But at what expense to individuals? The human resources, human relations model would be thinking about how do we make this virtual work rewarding, right? How do we share our appreciation of workers and listening to workers and in this virtual world? And probably they're rethinking how to hold events virtually, how to give recognition virtually. You see the virtual graduations, you see the virtual retirements. And also, I think that the human resources model takes advantage of the change to increase and provide a variety of information, probably too much information, over various channels, because now people are using those channels more. And then finally, in our cultural organizational pattern, right, where things are more free-flowing, there have to be new symbols of the culture emerging. It would be fascinating to see, for example, how Google has adapted to working from home in the virtual world in terms of the flow of their communication and the flow of the culture that we saw visually was all around them. I kind of laugh because I think about, I know somebody whose son works for a company that was very much like Google and used to bring all his food home, right, from work, all his dinner food home, and would eat breakfast and lunch at work. And now that they're working from home, they have to provide their own food. And not only is it a greater expense, but all of a sudden now they have to use their kitchen at home. So I think there's a lot of change for people that were relying on their work environment to be this free-flowing kind of home-work interaction, and now suddenly they're back in their homes without that. So I think these are all going to be interesting patterns to keep your eye on. All right, finally, I've talked to some of you in the one-to-ones about this, right? What I'm trying to do with these 3 lectures is to give you some tools that you can use to help you understand an organization that you go into as an external consultant or even an internal consultant, right? Even just working in an organization, I think these tools are useful to understand what's happening, and specifically looking at how the communication in the organization is or is not being done in a way that is feeling like it's helping and aiding the success of the organization. So we looked at the formal communication patterns, right? And in your toolbox, you can collect data looking at a specific channel of communication or across these channels of communication. And you can look at the type of content, you can look at the flow, you can look at the style in order to identify contradictions, inconsistencies, or strengths that various communication channels are bringing to the organization. Is there a cultural norm, right, to the formal communication in an organization? Looking at those artifacts, the communication artifacts in specific, that help you understand what the culture of the organization is. And then we have this media richness. How rich is a specific channel? And can you help improve the richness of a channel? Right, understanding that uncertainty and ambiguity are signs that the channel may be how the channel is being used may be interfering, right, with good, strong communication in that organization. And finally, are there informal roles that you need to identify or watch for? And if you have the luxury of gathering some data and the ability to do the analysis, identifying isolates and liaisons and opinion leaders to help you understand why the formal flow isn't what is making things happen in an organization. This is especially true for change, right? Understanding the people you need to hear and listen to and the people you need to get their support for effecting change in an organization. So that's your toolbox from my first 3 lectures. I'm hopeful that when I come back in the spring, we'll be able to talk about diversity and how communication is and is not affecting diversity in the organization. We'll be able to talk more about specific group communication. And I'd also like to talk a little bit more about leaders and how they communicate. All right, thank you. We are done.